All right, so I want to start off with a little land acknowledgement. This was written by one of the other Mount Joy organizers, Miku Paul. We acknowledge that Mount Joy stands on indigenous land. The Dawnland tribes made Meshuggah their home for thousands of years. This region was a site for seasonal gatherings, most especially sustenance fishing and harvesting shellfish. In the Wabanaki spirit of generosity and sharing, we offer this orchard to the community so that all who live here may have sustenance. This area is also the historic site of 19th century Fort Loyal, where a great battle was fought over rights and resources. Our goal is to practice the reciprocity principle and restore our relationship to the land which sustains us all. And I think it would be lacking to offer a land acknowledgement without prodding everyone towards some sort of action, because the genocidal project of colonization is something that continues to this day. Both the state and federal government continue to not even obey their own laws with respect to all tribal nations and the Wabanaki tribes, the Micmac, the Maliseet, the Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, thank you, are no different, and actually kind of have gotten an even rawer deal than some of the other tribes, because a lot of the other federally recognized tribes get a bunch of stuff that the Wabanaki tribes only get if they're specifically written into the laws. So there's lots of problems. I recommend looking into Wabanaki Reach and Sunlight Media Collective for sort of latest news on those issues. Also, I can't recommend enough This Land podcast. Really, really important issues around the Indian Child Welfare Act. All right, so on to the orchard. This space is really special as a space for urban agriculture in Portland, because since colonization, this hillside has never been built up. It's always been a farm or a park. So the massive amounts of lead in the soil all around us don't really apply to this space, which is awesome because it means we don't need to remediate soil. We can just grow food directly in the soil without worrying about any lead contamination. Going back a few decades, this hillside was all lawn. So it was mowed like this. But because of the slope, it was never really utilized too much. And eventually, the city decided that that was a waste of time and energy to just be mowing it all the time. And the lawn was allowed to sort of fallow into a meadow. They did make an effort to reintroduce some native species, which is cool. So you'll see over in the more meadowy areas a lot of milkweed, a lot of little blue stem grass, several species of aster. Really nice, kind of returning some habitat to the city, which is awesome. And about 6 years ago, the city arborist, Jeff Tarling, along with the current mayor and some other sort of tree advocates, decided that this would be a great place for a community orchard, and they planted a dozen apple trees right here. These were little tiny apple trees, about yay tall, and they were just completely lost in the weeds. So a call went out to the community for people who might want to take on the labor of caring for some of these trees. And that's where my friend Kristen Sheehy got involved, and she's still an organizer for Mount Joy. And she brought together a group of 5 people, and we kind of thought what we were going to be doing is maybe putting like a circle about this big of sheet mulch around each tree, and maybe planting some comfrey. And we met on this site on a September evening, and there was this beautiful sunset and this beautiful hillside, and we decided that it was too beautiful of a site to do this sort of bare minimum project, and we started organizing to kind of go all in on a diversified community orchard. And pretty much through the last 5 growing seasons, we've had monthly meetings, and we've gone from 12 apple trees to over 100 fruit trees, over 20 species of woody fruit-bearing plants. I haven't counted recently, but probably 30 or 40 species of companion plants, many of them edible or medicinal. And the work continues. All of this has been done with volunteer labor and basically no budget. The city has been really great about providing trees, providing wood chips, and occasionally compost. So the sort of materials that we need are often taken care of by the city, and it's really just bringing in the community to do the actual labor of caring for the orchard that has made this project a success. And we've been successful in many of our goals, both to, provide this space, which produces food for the community, but also to provide a model of urban agriculture. So since this project has been relatively successsive, several other community orchards and similar projects have popped up around the city and in neighboring towns. And I've been, involved this much in a lot of those projects, and a lot of the people who are behind those projects have been really inspired by this space. So that's one of the things we're trying to do. The areas where we have not done well are basically amount to community outreach. We really need to work on having more signage, more media describing the space so that people can know what's happening here. And we especially feel like we need to reach out to immigrant communities who live in this neighborhood all over the place, but often are missing from Mount Joy events. And I'm not here enough to know if those people are accessing the orchard adequately, but we want to make sure that we're trying to draw those people in and make them feel welcome and make sure it's accessible for everyone. The model of Mount Joy, as far as like how the food gets harvested and where it goes, is what we call a free-to-pick public orchard. So basically anybody who's walking past at any time, you see fruit that's ripe, you're welcome to pick it. And we encourage people to, harvest enough so that nothing goes to waste. But, if there's a tree that's loaded with apples, you shouldn't maybe take all of them unless it seems like, okay, these are about to go by, in which case, clean it out. Eventually, we hope to be producing so much fruit here that we can transition into, still having it free to pick for anybody, but also having work parties focused on harvest, where we can then, harvest all those apples that are about to go by and make sure that they get out into the community to the people who need them the most. So that's kind of the basic gist. I guess I should mention we have more work parties coming up this year if you want to get involved with that. Our next one it's the last Thursday in October at 4 p.m. I don't remember the date. And then our final wrap-up event, I believe, is the second Saturday in November, starting at 9. The last October work party will focus on just kind of general cleanup and weeding, probably spreading some leaf mulch, and the final wrap-up will be getting the trees ready for winter by making and placing tree guards. which protect the base of the tree from damage from rodents over the winter. And then the second half of that day will be a community acorn processing workshop. So I'll kind of run you through the process of making acorns into human food. What's that? It's the second Saturday in November, and the acorn stuff 13th. Starts at 1. 13th, thank you.
1 o'clock?
Yep. And if you collect acorns in the park or wherever, you can bring those with you to process, but that's not necessary. If you want to just learn about it, you can come and learn. It's a bad acorn year, so there's not a ton of acorns out there to find. But you can still learn the process and practice and be ready for next year. All right, so moving on from that sort of general stuff, I want to introduce y'all to several different types of trees that are in the orchard, and there's a lot of unusual plants here that we'll be talking about, and so we'll go over a bunch of different interesting trees, and then we'll talk about some of the herbaceous species as well that are in the orchard. We're getting right down to the end of the season, so a lot of the plants that I would normally have people like, oh, taste this, are like kind of gone by. But there'll be some interesting stuff to taste still, and I think there's at least one type of fruit yet to harvest. So hopefully you'll leave here with some fruit and some knowledge about what to pick next year. So this is a type of tree that I am really excited about currently. This is an Asian pear. And if you look kind of down here, you can see there's 3 major stems coming out of a single stem. And the reason for that is this tree was grown here using a technique called bark grafting. And to understand kind of the story of this tree and how it got here, we need a little bit of context for the city. So city street trees tend to go in waves. There were, over 100 years ago, it was really popular to plant American linden. You can still see tons of them around Back Bay. And all of those trees were grown in a city-owned nursery in what is now Payson Park. And a more recent wave of street tree planting involved a plant called Calorie Pear, also known as Bradford pear. Bradford is one specific calorie pear. And those trees, have beautiful flowers, they grow really fast, but they also have this really problematic thing that they do, which is make tons of pears. But the pears are this big, so they're not good for humans to eat, and birds really like to eat them. And the birds fly all over the city, especially in nice green spaces like this, and they poop out those calorie pear seeds, and they are now like one of the major woody weeds in this area. And places further south, they're even more of a problem. But as we get up to, sort of that corner of the orchard, you'll see tons of calorie pears just growing in the field. And they get mowed every year, and once in a while the city will spray them with herbicide, and they just keep going. So it's, not great. However, they do have a silver lining, and that silver lining is they make an excellent rootstock for both Asian and European culinary pears. So in a very simple process, which is done in the spring, and I teach a workshop on it every year, so if you're interested in learning, come back in the spring. You can take a scion, which is a dormant twig of first-year growth. So once these leaves fall off in the winter, this could be harvested as a scion. And you cut an angle onto it, and you cut off either the whole stem, if it's a large or a smallish tree, or a branch of one of these feral Calorie Pears, and you just jam it on there, tape it up with some electrical tape, seal the cut ends with wax or liquid asphalt, and it grows into a edible pear. This tree is 2 years old. I've seen other ones on the other side of town at Harborview Park that grew 6 feet in a single year and bore fruit in 2 years.
This had a good crop of fruit. It was small,
yeah.
But it was good.
So this tree, after only 2 years, has been converted from this, invasive tree that's like, feeds some birds, has pretty flowers, but is also, a problem in some ways, to this amazing resource of delicious pears that are, really abundant and pretty disease resistant. These at my house were like perfectly clean when all my apples were like all, weird and deformed and bug eaten. And this is something that you can kind of, if you've heard of guerrilla grafting, this is a great opportunity for that, because wherever you find these Calorie Pears growing in a ditch or whatever, no one's going to care if you turn that into a fruit tree. You could also do that to a street tree, and some people say, oh, that's unethical in this way, and some people say, oh, that's wonderful. In my opinion, it really depends on what happens after you make that graft. So if you're going to be there to pick the fruit and clean up any mess that's created, and you want to convert that Calorie Pear in front of your house into, an edible pear, I would say go for it. Just don't get caught and clean up any messes that happen. That's just my opinion. But I wouldn't say, oh, you should do this to every Calorie Pear you find and then walk away and never come back. That might be a little problematic. Anyway, so this is Hosui Asian pear on a Calorie Pear rootstock. Fred, do you happen to remember when this was ripe? Maybe like end of August? Yeah. So
at first it didn't look like it had any.
Yeah.
The grass was tall, and then you go and you're like, and the fruit had hung down into the grass, so it was like hidden, and people didn't see it.
Yeah, and if you've ever had an Asian pear, they're really interesting. They're super sweet, have kind of a floral flavor, and they're much crispier than a European pear, kind of more like an apple. Anyway.
Is there any more of the Calorie Pear growing, or did you just chop it off?
Great question. So this is the Calorie Pear. These are the 3 scions that were originally grafted on. And I usually have my clippers on my belt, but this is Calorie Pear.
Okay.
So this is where the graft happened. Anything below that is Calorie Pear, and anything above that is Asian pear.
So when it was grafted, did you just literally
cut off 100%? Yep. Which channels all the energy that's in those roots into those scions, which is how you can get 6 feet of growth in a year from a 2-inch twig.
When this tree is 10 years old, will that base move up a little bit, or that's where it's going to stay?
That's where it's going to stay forever.
Smaller.
Yep.
So you could cut it up higher.
Yep.
And have it as a...
Yep, and you can, well, we'll move on to the next one. There's
some winter, then you'll prune off those bottom.
Yes. Yeah. And because now we've got like 3+ major stems coming off of that point, eventually we're going to pick the best one and cut off all the rest, so we go back to having a single trunk. Just because this formation tends to lead to breakage. When you have like 3 stems all crowded together, they're just not as strong as like one. But I've got more to tell you about grafting, more magic of plants right down this way. Yep.
You might want to repeat questions when people ask them, because they're probably not picking up on them.
Excellent, thank you. So this tree has suffered some damage. There was a whole branch here that just tore off because of the weight of the fruit on it. But this is another Calorie Pear. You can see all this growth at the bottom. That's where we've been like pruning it back for years, and it just keeps suckering up. It's just kind of how it goes. This tree we did as a demonstration. So,
When?
great question. I think we've done 2 demonstrations on this spring and the spring before that. So here is a graft that was done 2 years ago, and here's one that was done this spring. So you can actually see the bark graft right here. So that's where the scion was kind of jammed underneath the bark, and the tree has just completely grown around it.
They use the asphalt.
Yep, and the black stuff is liquid asphalt, a product called Tree Coat.
What is that actually?
It's literally liquid asphalt.
Oh, it's like street asphalt.
Yep. And that's great if you're going to be doing a lot of grafting. Bizarrely, what I would recommend if you're just going to do a little grafting is toilet bowl wax, which is a very soft wax ring that you can buy at the hardware store for like less than $5. And it's so soft that you can just kind of smear it on there with your finger. And it's just kind of easier to use and somewhat cheaper. So one of the neat things about this tree is not only do we have the Calorie Pear rootstock, but we've got, the Hosui Asian pear. We've got Flemish Beauty, which is a European pear. We've got Clara Fries, another European pear. And then right here, not only do we have a different type of graft, this is called a Cleft Graft. So this is all pear, and we've got a Cleft Graft, and this is an apple called Winter Banana. And Winter Banana is unusual for apples in that it will intergraft with pears, which is just amazing. Most of the time, if you graft an apple onto a pear, it will either not grow or it'll grow poorly for a year or 2 and then die. Winter Banana seems to grow long-term on pear roots, which is awesome. It's not a particularly good apple in my opinion, but it's an amazing trick just to be like, oh look, this tree grows 2 species of pear, maybe 3 if you let it, and it grows apples. But also, if you're guerrilla grafting in a ditch somewhere, you can graft the tree over to Winter Banana, and then onto that Winter Banana wood, you can graft any kind of apple you want. And there are other fruits that you can graft onto pear roots. So Aronia, which is a very, I don't think they're particularly good to eat, but they're super high in antioxidants. So they make a nice mixed, like admixture fruit. So you can put some Aronia in your applesauce and it turns it like the color of her jacket and adds a bunch of antioxidants. You can also graft medlar onto pear, which is a tree we'll be seeing shortly. And I think you might also be able to graft quince, which is another fruit we'll see further up the hill. So there's lots of cool opportunities for.
Does it work in terms of apple-based to pear? Does that also not work, or are apples
Yes,
better?
it only works with Winter Banana. So you can graft pears onto apple roots if you've already got Winter Banana on there. Yeah, and that's called, when you have rootstock, then a graft, then something else, that's called an interstem. And you can do all sorts of wild stuff with that too. For instance, you can take Bud 9, which is a truly dwarf apple tree, tops out around 6 to 8 feet tall. You can take a scion of that and graft it onto standard size roots that would normally grow an apple tree 40 feet tall if left unpruned, and it will have a dwarfing effect on what you graft on top of it.
Is it does it negatively affect the tree that you graft onto to have so many different varietals grafted onto it at all?
Mostly no. I've seen trees with over 100 varieties on them, and they were still growing great. The only real downside is disease transmission. So apples, like humans, can get viruses, and if you have 5 varieties on a tree, you're 5 times more likely to get a virus. If you have 100, you're 100 times more likely. So if you're trying to preserve a rare variety, it's best to not put it on a tree with 10 other things. It's like, oh, this is the only, source for this variety in my area or in the world or whatever. Let's leave that one on its own roots, or its own rootstock, so that we risk getting that one sick. And a lot of these viruses are fairly benign, but once they're in there, these trees can live for hundreds of years, and they never go away, basically.
Does the fruit mix at all, or do they just stay?
They stay totally distinct. There's very, very little genetic transmission between rootstock and scion. There is thought to be a tiny bit, but for the most part, they stay totally distinct, which is pretty wild. All right. Any other questions on grafting and stuff like this? All right, cool. Moving on.
Is there a time of year that's best? Is it spring that's best for grafting?
It depends on what kind of grafting you're doing. This graft is called a bark graft. When I teach classes, this takes about 10 minutes to learn, and people usually have around a 90% success rate. All of these grafts were done by people who I taught in 10 minutes, and they all succeeded. There are many other types of grafts, and this one's best done first thing in the spring. There's also bud grafting, where instead of using a scion, which is like a little piece of twig, you use just a single bud. And that happens from late June to kind of end of July. It's a little bit more finicky. It's not quite as easy to learn. I completely forgot about repeating questions. So these are a type of edible fruited dogwood called a Cornelian Cherry. The botanical name is Cornus moss. And these are some of my favorite fruit trees because they're super beautiful and they are so pest and disease resistant that when people are thinking about sort of edible landscape plants, this is one of my prime recommendations. The fruit is actually pear-shaped. It's about this big, and I think quite delicious. This one was absolutely loaded with fruit this year. They have a flavor kind of all their own, so they don't taste just like a cherry, and when they're totally dead ripe, they are substantially squishier than a cherry. But they have some advantages even beyond being easy to grow. One is that they shake out of the tree. So as this tree grows, we'll be pruning away a lot of the lower limbs, and it will, have some space underneath it like the rest of the trees. And at that point, you'll be able to put a tarp underneath it, and when the fruit is ripe, you can just shake it out of the tree rather than individually picking these small fruit. Another big advantage is the ripe fruit is so squishy that you can process it with a food mill, which is one of those cranky things you use to make applesauce, rather than having to punch out the individual seeds like you would with cherries. They make wonderful sauces, beverages, amazing fruit leather. They're really a fun fruit and one that I think we'll probably be planting more of as we kind of fill in the little gaps in the orchard. This is another very unusual plant that we have here in the orchard. This is a Yellowhorn. They are a small nut tree or large shrub from China. This one right here is the first one that I've ever seen bear fruit in Maine. So they're very unusual, and it bears a pod a little bit smaller than a tennis ball that opens up, and inside there's about a dozen small nuts, which are fairly easy to crack, and they're very, very fatty, and they taste kind of like macadamia nuts. Before we really started the tour, I was talking about the hand-powered oil press that you can borrow from the Curtis Memorial Library in Brunswick. And this would be a prime candidate for using that on, because I think the nuts are something like 70% fat. So you'd get a really good yield of oil if you were growing these and pressing them for a cooking oil. The trees are also really beautiful. They make these big sprays of white flowers with an orange center, and then as the flower matures, the center turns red. And they're just really neat looking. All right. Yep, Yellowhorn. Yep.
Thorn.
Horn, and it's one word. Xanthoceras sorbifolium is the botanical name, and I can't spell that.
With an X.
Yes, Xanthoceras with an X. This is a tree that I love to talk about, but I've yet to really enjoy eating it. This is called a medlar. And this is a fruit that was quite popular in like 1400s Europe. And at that time, the English common name was the open arse fruit, which is just lovely. And one of the interesting aspects of this fruit is they're nearly ripe now, but they're rock hard. And if you tried to eat them, you would be very disappointed. What you're supposed to do with them is a process called bletting, which basically involves storing them in a cool spot and waiting for them to almost rot. If you imagine a banana that is entirely brown, that is a bletted banana. And if you imagine the flavor of that brown banana, it's super sweet, kind of cloying. That sort of flavor change happens to the medlar. And when they are perfectly bletted, supposedly they taste like spiced apple butter, which sounds phenomenal. I want that. I have never yet achieved that. But maybe this will be the year. And definitely feel free to take a medlar home with you and blet it. And if you get good results, please let me know.
So to blet it, you just keep it in like a...
I think you just basically leave it out, and when it gets real squishy, you eat it. I think it takes like a month or two.
Or you bury sawdust or leaves or wood chips.
Yeah. Have you successfully bletted them? No, me either. Anyway, I have heard that like if you treat them right, they are a delicious fruit. I've yet to crack the code on that one, which is kind of typical of a lot of plants that are really easy to grow in our climate. Sometimes, it's like, oh, this plant grows amazingly, but it doesn't taste very good. And when we get to herbaceous stuff, there's plants like that where maybe when they're really tender, really young, or certain parts are like, oh, okay, this is super easy. All you have to do is steam it, and it's great. But there are other parts of the plant that, if you cook them just so, they're wonderful. But it takes a certain, cultural know-how. Anyway, moving on. I have not.
It's fucking
He's hilarious.
It's really, I mean, I'm surprised they put it up there because it would dissuade anyone from buying.
Yeah, truth in advertising, I guess. So of all the trees in the orchard, there's lots of exciting ones. This one might be the one I'm most excited about. And there are 4 right here that are all seedling apricots. And they're not just any seedling apricots. The seeds for these trees came from a tree over on Congress Street. That is the largest, most productive, and healthiest apricot that I know of in southern Maine. The story goes, and I've heard this from several people, but I've never tracked down the person who planted it. But the story goes that a immigrant brought a seed from his country of origin and planted it, and it grew into that tree. I believe he was from Syria, but I could have that wrong. Anyway, this tree has been there since the 80s, produces excellent annual crops of nearly disease-free fruit. And someone at one of our work parties brought us these clean seeds from this tree. And it was like, hey, you should have these to plant in the orchard. And I took those seeds and continued to carefully store them until I went to the East End Community School right here at the top of the hill and spent a morning with the kindergartners there and just kind of told them about seeds and how they grow and this and that. And every kid got to plant a seed in a little pot and grow something on the windowsill of the class. And in the last week of school, I came back and we planted those trees out into the orchard. And this is what grew. This year, this tree had first fruit, and they were very tasty. I unfortunately missed that. Like I ate one when they were just ripe enough to eat, so I kind of missed them at their peak. But next year, I'm gonna get a perfect one. But it's really exciting to me that those kids got the opportunity to grow a tree from seed, and since they were kindergartners, unless they've moved, they're probably still at that school. The East End Community School now has a dedicated garden teacher, and she's bringing the kids into the orchard all the time. So hopefully those kids get to, see the fruits of their labor, so to speak. So these are ones I'm really excited about, and I'm really excited about continuing to grow some experimental stuff in the orchard.
How many years are
The question was, how many years did it take? And this tree is 4 years old. Pretty amazing turnaround. Like, that's a nice looking tree to go from a seed to a tree in 4 years. And you can see, like, this is, if you're familiar with trying to grow apricots here, this is mind-boggling that this tree still looks good in this time of year. The reason apricots don't grow so well in Maine is not that they're not hardy, it's that they come from very arid climates. And it is not arid here. It is humid as hell, especially this year. And that humidity tends to cause leaf diseases, which is what ends up killing apricots around here. So these trees look great even after a very humid summer. So I hope they have long and productive lives.
When are they old enough to plant?
Basically immediately. These trees were about this tall when they went into the ground.
And you had to protect them, like
Nope. What we did was we like sheet mulched like this, because if you plant a tree that's this tall in turf, probably going to die. But if you can give that tree a little bit of room to grow, they'll usually take right off. And it's nice to be able to directly plant out small seedlings, because then their roots grow, deep into the ground immediately. You never get a chance to have sort of spiraling roots that are all bound up, and that can cause a lot of problems. Early summer. All right, I think we'll maybe talk about one more tree and then move on to herbaceous plants. And it looks like these got harvested, but when I was here not too long ago, these quince trees had a whole bunch of... Oh, excellent. All right, so this is a quince. Who here is familiar with quinces? All right, we've got a special group. Usually people are like, oh, it's like an apple or a pear. Oh, it doesn't taste very good. And a quince, this one's ripe, and it is rock hard. Nearly inedible as a fresh fruit. But as you probably know, if you know what a quince is, this is a absolutely wonderful baking fruit. So mixed in with pies, jams, jellies, sauces, adds a really nice flavor, and potentially even more important than that flavor is the huge amount of pectin in one of these. So even just a quarter of a quince, if you grate it into a pie, into a jam, into a jelly, it's going to make that whole batch really set up with a nice firm texture. They also have a really pleasant smell. So I'll pass this around.
It's not very fuzzy, that one.
No, not all of them are fuzzy.
I've only seen the fuzzy ones.
Yeah. So it has a pleasant floral smell to it, and it's just a kind of underappreciated fruit. Also super easy to grow generally, and part of that is the fruit is so hard that a lot of the insect pests that are a real problem in apples just can't even chew through it.
Is it native to Maine, or?
It is not. So the quince is a European species. At least this, which is what I would call a true quince or a tree quince. There's also a shrubby quince that is frequently grown as an ornamental plant, which actually comes from a completely different genus, but still makes an edible fruit that's very, very similar, and can basically be treated the same. All right, if anyone has any tree questions before I move on. I skipped peaches because most people know what peaches are, but I would be happy to talk a little bit about peaches if people want to hear about peaches. I'll just do a quick peach thing. There are a few peaches scattered throughout the orchard. There's one there, one above that, one up in that corner, and then the whole first row down by Washington Ave is all peaches. They ripen mid to late summer and are super delicious. If you've never had a tree-ripened peach, I will give you this warning. Once you have had a tree-ripened peach, you will probably not be happy with anything you can buy at Hannaford. So, proceed with caution. All right, so I want to talk about these bees for just a second, and then we'll move on to herbaceous plants.
It's actually a great day for filming, being all overcast and shit.
Yeah, perfect. Hopefully this windscreen works. All right, so This beehive is not really associated with the orchard. It's owned by some random city of Portland resident who didn't have a good spot in their yard for a beehive and asked the Parks Department if they could park their beehive here. And wonderfully, the Parks Department said yes, because they have said no to this in the past. But I think this is a really exciting precedent to be set because it makes beekeeping that much more accessible to people. You can live in a tiny apartment and not have a yard or whatever, or you can have a landlord who says, "Were you crazy? You can't have bees here." And as long as you can, get together the equipment, you should be able to have bees in a public park. Bees are generally non-aggressive unless you're like bumping up against the hive or like walking directly in front of it. So here in a spot where, people aren't going to be really getting right up in the hive's business unless they're overly curious. I think these, there's room for several hives here. And we get the benefit in the orchard of pollination. Although we've never had issues with pollination because Mount Joy is situated in over 10 acres of fairly diverse green space. We have a very good population of native pollinators that do a great job with the orchard. All right, so I think we'll shift gears a little bit and move on to herbaceous plants.
Quick question for you.
Yes.
North-facing slope is ideal for fruit trees, or is that just because that was available?
That's just what was available. North-facing slope does present some issues of you're just not going to get as much heat as a south-facing slope, but it also prevents or mitigates the effects of blooming too early. So since you don't get that intense spring heat, it delays blooming, and then you're less likely to have issues with blooms popping and then getting killed by frost. All right, so from this angle, if you're looking down the hill, everything to the left is Mount Joy Orchard, and we pretty much have carte blanche from the city to manage this space how we want and to plant whatever we want within reason there. This space is dedicated to being a meadow, so we're not supposed to plant anything woody in here because people do sled on this hill, and we don't want to create any obstructions for that. And if you see all these woody plants up there, those are all Calorie Pears that were bird planted. And you can see that most of them have many stems. That's because they are what's called coppiced. They've been mowed repeatedly, and the mowing does not kill them. It just causes them to regenerate with a bunch of stems. That said, we have been starting to plant in this area. Now, if you look at most of the meadow, the idea was to create a habitat for native meadow plants and the animal species that depend on them. And 99% of what you see are Eurasian turf grasses, lupins from the Pacific Northwest, and the seed heads that you see now are feral carrots, more commonly known as Queen Anne's lace. So we've been doing some experimentation with using tarps to kill off the existing plants in this area and replace them with native meadow plants. So right here, you can see an area that we covered with a tarp for a full growing season, almost completely eliminating the turf grass, and then planted back with divisions from the orchard plantings and divisions from my garden. And some of the plants that we see here are plants like mountain mint mountain mint. And if you want to taste it, I'll pass this around. You can tear off a leaf. Mountain mint is a native plant that's much less spready than a regular mint. I describe the flavor as being mintier than mint. So if you don't like mint, I wouldn't taste it. Maybe just smell it. But it's a wonderful plant for pollinators. Very pretty. And will continue to spread through here. There's actually two species of mountain mint. This is clustered mountain mint, and that one with more narrow leaves is narrow-leaved mountain mint. We've got...
So that's native?
Yep. And all of these plants are either native to Maine or native to the bioregion, at least. We got milkweed, which is a plant that sort of everyone used to hate because the plant's nearly indestructible and pretty spready, but is starting to gain some appreciation because it's the larval host plant for monarch butterflies. I think milkweed deserves a lot more appreciation as a human food. Throughout the season, there are many parts that are edible. They should all be eaten cooked, but you don't need to cook it a lot, just like steamed for a few minutes is usually plenty. You should read up on milkweed a little bit before you eat it, just to make sure you're eating the right parts at the right time. And the first time you should eat it, just eat a little bit, because some people are kind of sensitive to it. So the edible parts are the spring shoots, the new growth tips through the summer, the flower buds, the flowers, and the young seed pods. And they're all, I think, quite delicious. Aside from supporting monarch butterflies and being a lovely perennial vegetable for humans, there are several other species that only feed on milkweed. So there's several species of milkweed-specific aphids, there's milkweed bugs, there's milkweed caterpillars. So this plant is really sort of a powerhouse of supporting native insects as well. Here we have some wild bergamot or wild bee balm, which has passed its prime for harvesting, but actually has a quite pleasant flavor. It makes a nice tea. You can also use it as a culinary herb. It tastes kind of like oregano, but certainly with a flavor all its own. And with a name like bee balm, obviously, is quite attractive to pollinators. This is Rudbeckia Liciniata, which has a few different other names. Cutleaf coneflower is the most common English name, or sochan, which I might be botching the pronunciation of, but is the Cherokee name. And I've been told that this is one of the sort of foundational plants of Cherokee cuisine. Native all across the continent, has really nice flowers that have only recently gone by, sort of a yellow sunflower similar to this, which is a sunchoke. And this one, sochan, or cutleaf coneflower. And then these seed heads, you can see, if you look closely, there's some chunks taken out of them. These are really good overwintering and migration food for a lot of different types of birds. So if you watch these plants, you'll see birds landing up here and eating those seeds. Just in this patch, we have several different species of goldenrod. This one is the most common Canada goldenrod. I'm not even sure what species this is. And somewhere around here, there's also a flat-top goldenrod, which is just a nice sort of late summer pollinator plant. This is a sunchoke, also known as Jerusalem artichoke or Tarasol. And these have been growing here for hundreds or thousands of years, but they're really more of an upper Midwest native. But we included them in this meadow because they provide a lot of structure, and really late season blooms for pollinators, as well as human food. They make an edible tuber. What else we got in this area? This is Agastaki's Nepatoides, which is a near native relative of Anis hyssop, and this is Anis hyssop. They're both in the same family, which is the mint family. You can see that classic square stem, very attractive to pollinators. This one, the leaves have a really nice licoricey taste. It makes a nice tea. This one, the leaves are also edible, but have much less of a flavor to them. And one final plant for this area, we did, while we are trying to get rid of a lot of the grasses, we did also plant a native grass. This is sweetgrass. And we hope that will kind of spread and fill in around all the other perennials.
Quick question around the technique. So you put the tarp down for
Yep.
the season and you planted. If you were to leave this now for another 2 years, I assume the grasses would come in again, but
Yes.
there would still be spread of these grasses.
Yep.
Or there'd be a balance.
Yeah.
Dominate the other.
Well, there's already a lot of this sheep sorrel moving in, but that stays really low. A lot of the turf grasses tend to stay pretty low. So I think most, if not all, of these species are secure and will continue to grow, especially the Rudbeckia. Those tend to spread by rhizome, as do almost all these plants. So since we've kind of given them an edge for a little while, I think they'll continue to exist in this space. Techniques like this really scale super well. So if you do a little bit, the amount of edge where grass can creep in is a lot compared to how much space you have. But if you do it with a tarp that's 100 feet by 100 feet, there's way less edge compared to how much interior space there is. So now that we've kind of proven the concept of this is working great, we plan to continue this with a much larger tarp.
We have a similar meadow that we want to make more native again.
Yep.
So that'll be interesting.
This seems to be the best method. You can also use cardboard sheet mulching, but this I thought was very effective. One thing I would recommend is use rocks to weigh down the tarp, not sandbags. We used sandbags and then spent several hours picking up little bits of disintegrating sandbag. So we won't do that again.
All of this dead seed, or these seed pods here, this is Yara or
Queen Anne's
Queen
lace,
Anne's lace? Okay.
which is just a feral carrot.
And is this our friend in the shorter version?
I'm not this.
Probably.
Yeah, I think it is. Pretty sure. So this was our first experiment, and this was tarped off at the same time as that one, but instead of planting with divisions of existing plants, we broadcast seed into here, and also threw in a few sunchoke tubers. And unfortunately, we did that in the driest year on record. So a lot of plants didn't, or couldn't hack it. So you'll see a lot of regrowth of plants that weren't ones that we had intended to grow. So there's a lot of mullein in there. There's a lot of grass, a lot of obviously tons of Queen Anne's lace. But I am also seeing more and more different species that are only growing right here. So for instance, there's this Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Susan. those are basically non-existent in this whole field. But right here where we threw down seed, there's a small population of them. This is a Coreopsis that definitely came in with that seed mix. There's an aster right there that I haven't seen much of. This looks like that wild bergamot or Monarda fistulosa. So I wouldn't say this was a total failure, but the ones that we established from divisions bulked up and did much better, much quicker. So we've got a few different things going on in this area. We've got raspberries, and these were planted originally as like maybe 3 canes of raspberry that were left over from a plant swap. And we're like, oh, we'll just throw them in wherever. And they've spread very nicely, and they're producing so well that we couldn't bear to like really tear them out. But this is eventually going to be a management thing where like we're going to have to come a few times a year and just mow around the edges to keep the raspberries in the raspberry area and not everywhere. These beds of Swiss chard and kale are part of a collaboration with Presente, Maine. And so this will all get harvested fairly soon to be part of Presente's food brigade food distribution. And then we'll talk about a few different perennials along here in the tree row. Kind of. Not. I wouldn't really call them invasive. They grow very well, but they generally don't sort of take over and like wreck habitats like a plant that is more of a problem, like knotweed, purple loosestrife, stuff like that. So this plant right here is called Dystenia. It's in the carrot family, or Apiaceae. And it's one of my favorite perennial vegetables. So I'll pass this around if you want to taste it.
What's it called?
Dystenia. And it's got sort of a celery-like flavor to it. And a really, really long season. These will actually pop up out of ground that is completely frozen, which I don't understand how they do that. And then even this late in the season, they're still producing fairly young, tender leaves. And they're fine raw, but I think their best use is in soups and stir fries and stuff like that in place of celery. They also make a huge seed head, which you can see right here. So that makes a flower very similar to Queen Anne's lace, but much larger, and very, very attractive to lots of different kinds of pollinators. This is another perennial from the same family. This is lovage. Lovage has a strong and distinct flavor, which not everybody likes, but I'll pass them around in case you want to try it. The trick to cooking with lovage is to not use too much. It is really nice.
This lovage?
Yep, in small amounts. But it's really easy to ruin something by putting in like a whole cup of lovage, and then it just tastes like lovage.
I feel like that would be good cocktail.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like a lovage simple syrup would be amazing. This is chicory. If you've ever had like chicory coffee or coffee, this is the plant that it comes from. Yep. It would be the roots of first year plants, then roasted.
Is everything here free for anyone to pick, or is this like...
So the original intention was for this to be specifically for Presente, but it ended up not being so productive. Like, you would be welcome to take some. And if this project continues into the future, we'll kind of clarify that, and there'll be like a sign that's like, this is for this specifically. If you need food, take whatever you want. But if you're food secure, leave this and it'll get harvested for distribution. But I'm not sure if this project is going to continue or not. It's been a really cool project, but I just don't know if there's enough organizing capacity to support doing it well. I don't believe so. All right, so we're running out of time, but there are a couple more plants that I'd like to point out.
Pissed off he needs a hog salad.
What's that?
Should have said hog salad.
Definitely not. So these right here are a plant called Turkish Rocket, which falls into the category of common names that just annoys the hell out of me. So many English common names are fit the formula of like familiar plant plus modifier. So rocket is a pretty common name for arugula. And somewhere along the line, someone was like, this plant grows in Turkey and it's vaguely like arugula. We should call it Turkish Rocket. It just, I don't know, it's one of my pet peeves. But this is a wonderful plant. Very, very productive, nearly indestructible, virtually pest-free, and pretty tasty. The greens taste like mustard greens. First thing in the spring, they are pretty tender and can be used just like mustard greens. They're shortly followed by flower buds, which is my favorite part to eat. Those resemble and taste a lot like broccoli rabe, with a little bit of almost like a seaweed flavor. The more mature greens like this tend to be kind of fuzzy. So I would say they're less good raw. But I know Tim has had good luck cooking them in like a Jamaican style peanut curry is one thing that he mentioned being good.
If you boil them, they're
Yeah. Also, like southern style collards, where you boil it first and then fry it in some fat. They're quite good. So this is a, I think, underutilized resource, because these plants can be, you could level this and in a couple weeks it would completely grow back. So there's a lot there to harvest. Same is true of the milkweed that's all over the place. You can harvest very heavily from milkweed, and they just bounce back really rapidly. There are some culinary or like some familiar culinary herbs scattered through this area. So this is oregano. There's some culinary sage right here. So these are nice resources, especially if you live close by and you want just like, oh, I just need a little bit of fresh sage for this thing I want to cook. You can come into the orchard and harvest that quite easily. Another plant that you'll see all over the place here is comfrey. So this right here is Bocking 14 comfrey. It's a sterile seeded hybrid, which means that you can plant this plant in a spot and that plant will be there probably for longer than you're alive, but they won't spread. Other types of comfrey that have viable seeds tend to set seeds and just grow and grow and grow, and they're very difficult to get rid of once they're established. So that's why we planted this variety. And right along here, you can see there's basically the whole edge of the bed is comfrey. And we did that on purpose to kind of establish a difference between this is a cultivated space with companion plants, and this is sort of a grassy path, and everything in this area can get mowed whenever someone comes through with a mower, and this stuff gets mowed infrequently, if ever. We also have another species of comfrey. This is Symphytum Caucasicum, which is not sterile seeded, so this one is the original, and all of these ones around it are seedlings. And this one's smaller, more subdued than the other one, and has beautiful bright blue flowers. And all the different types of comfrey have kind of the same properties. They're a really common orchard plant, mostly because they're a great dynamic accumulator. They have really deep roots and are good at accessing mineral nutrients from the subsoil and bringing those up to the surface, which helps to improve the soil around them over time for all the other plants. They're also medicinal. They have a chemical in there called allantoin or allantoin that increases cell replication, which explains some of the traditional names for comfrey, which are like knitbone or breakbone plant, because they help to, heal physical injuries. And they're very, very easy to grow. So if you ever want some comfrey for your garden, feel free to just dig up some pieces. They'll regenerate from a piece of root this big and turn into a big plant in a single season.
Is there a mushroom in there?
There is a mushroom in there.
It's a weird one.
Yeah, I think that is a stinkhorn.
There's a little hole in the top that I have.
Yeah. Stinkhorns? I think they technically are, but they smell real gross. Oh yeah. If I'm identifying them properly, they smell kind of like rotting meat, and that's to encourage flies to come and crawl over them, which helps to spread the spores around. We do have a species of edible mushroom growing in the mulch layer of the orchard called a wine cap, or Stropharia rugosa annulata, but I'm not seeing any right now to point out to you. Yes. All right, well, I think we're pretty much out of time. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And I'm going to try and do tours more or less monthly through the growing season next year. So as we get into more sort of prime harvest opportunities, I'll be able to kind of point those out as they come up through the season. So yeah, thanks for coming out, everyone, and hopefully I'll see you at future Mountjoy events.